can before stated, people got their opinions, and where do they come from? Each day seems like a natural fact, and what we think changes how we act. In the history of critical theory, the relation of opinions, facts, and acts has long been discussed, pondering on the question of ideology critique. Is false action based on false consciousness, or rather, is the later the effect of the former? How do theory and praxis, false and correct consciousness, intervene in the ever-shifting ground of reality? Relying on less-known texts like Brecht, Baudrillard and Althusser, the talk aims at giving these questions a further dialectical twist by relating them to the function theory has in contemporary art discourses. With the growing interest in an overproduction theory within the art world, theory of contemporary art seems to converge in the attempt to show, display, and exhibit a commodified attitude of critique, sometimes also called criticality. How then can theory be enacted as a concrete praxis of transforming critique rather than a speculative, commodified cultural capital? Question. So briefly from your biography, Sami Khatib is a cultural theorist and philosopher based in Berlin. He is a founding member of the Institute for Critical Analysis and Research in Chicago. He taught and engaged in research at Free University of Berlin, the Albanic Academy of Maastricht, American University of Beirut, and Academy of Fine Art of Vienna. Thank you again so much for being here with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Albert. It's a pleasure to be back. You can see by the bio, this is the precarity of academia. Every year you have a new appointment, so forget it. Now I'm in Karlsruhe, Fine Art Media University. I really like it there. I want to play a song actually, but no, I didn't put it on the other computer. Anyway, it's not the details there, so I should have prepared it better. But it's, you know Game of War probably as a post-punk band. Yesterday, Seskin, and he's also a big post-punk fan. There were, you would call them in today's parlance of American right-wingers cultural Marxists. So actually their theoretical background was Brecht, Gramsci, Benjamin, Marx for sure, Stuart Hall and others. So of course that they were singing about such a topic that is somehow related to why we do theory and why we do critical theory or why we do critique of ideology. It doesn't come as a surprise. But somehow the title of that song stuck in my mind, and it's kind of funny, a coincidence. There is a chapter in Baudrillard, I think in his 1987 book, that also is called Why Theory, Darwin's Theory, and there's another chapter by Louis Althusser, the famous Louis Althusser, the Marxist Louis Althusser, who also has a short paragraph called Why Theory. So I thought actually maybe that song, the record of which you can see behind me, is maybe reference to it. And yeah, in the history of critical theory, the relation between opinions, facts, and acts has long been discussed in the context of ideology critique. So if ideology is false consciousness as traditional Marxism would have it, is that false action the result or its very precondition? So the advent of theory, and more precisely maybe critical theory, promised a solution to such a circular, if not tautological, question. So is there first theory and then practice, or vice versa? It's obviously a circle. In such a more critical take, theory was not anymore regarded as the theoretical redoubling or mirroring of whatever some praxis we can understand, but the self-reflective capacity to interrogate relations such as the relationship of theory and practice, consciousness and action, imagination and reality, structure and effect, and so on. Maybe you can also say, what is the constitution and construction of reality? So instead of having a binary relation, action or doing and thinking or consciousness or theory, it was more about a relation of relationality. That was the topic of critical theory. You can also say all of these relations have in common that they have a dimension of negativity. So in a way you can say it's a theorization of relations of non-relation, in this very formal understanding. I won't go through the stages of these non-relations. Of course, you could have class antagonism, you could have first, second, third wave feminism, you have decolonial thought, you have psychoanalysis, the unconscious is already kind of evocation of what is a non-relation. But I will just jump into ideology critique and maybe a later take into ideology critique that some of you might be more familiar with. Of course, here the name Slavoj Žižek is important. So we're back in the early 1990s. You can say after the triumph of Western neoliberal capitalism. And Žižek had that kind of influential mapping of ideology, where he used the Hegelian triad. You remember Hegel? In itself, for itself, in and for itself. I mean, I shouldn't say that here because it's vulgar Hegelianism, but if you want to call it thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So the idea is you could map actually ideology according to ideology in itself, ideology for itself, and ideology in for itself. So what does that mean? So you would say that ideology should be first understood in itself. That would be ideology as a complex of ideas, theories, convictions, belief, argumentative procedures, maybe even patterns, rhetorics. Actually, this is what we would, in colloquial speech, understand by theory. But there's a second meaning of it, and that is already that was mentioned in the name that I already mentioned by Baudrillard and Althusser. That would be ideology in its very externality. So ideology for itself, ideology in practice. It doesn't have to be conscious. It doesn't have to be conscious content. So that would be the materiality of ideology. His famous term was ideological state apparatuses, school institutions, state-run institutions, universities, and so on. So you have, so to speak, ideology in the mind, you have ideology in the doing, and then you have the third one, and that is both fold into each other. And that is the third, the most elusive domain, and he calls it the spontaneous ideology at work at the heart of social reality itself. And the remark is by Žižek, it actually is questionable whether the term ideology here still fits. His main example is commodified fascism by Karl Marx, and if you're reader of Marx's Capital Volume 1, you might remember the term ideology isn't even used for it. It is not something about a conscious content of thinking. It's more in the doing and how doing and thinking are interwoven. He comes up with, Žižek comes up with a kind of instructive example. He recalls, of course, in the 1990s the case of liberalism. So liberalism is, of course, a doctrine developed from Locke to Hayek. Material doctrine means theory. Materialized in rituals and apparatuses. Of course, there's a free press, there's elections, there's a market, and of course, there's state institutions that regulate that. And it is also active in the spontaneous self-experience of subjects as free individuals. So it has also to do with mine or your, whatever, understanding of relation to society, within society, selfhood. So we could say this triad offered by Žižek covers most of the socio-political relations that are important for critical theory. So relations of theory, relations of practice, and the relations of the interrelatedness of theory and practice. We can say of theory in practice or practice in theory. so from a very abstract point of view. So from Zizek's instructive mapping of ideology, we can draw the conclusion that ideology is not simply a matter of consciousness, theory, or knowledge, but also about practice, institutions, and the relationship between consciousness and action, which partakes in the construction of reality. Okay, take here another quote. It's actually a very famous one, but also important, I think also nowadays still. So ideology has nothing to do with illusion, no? Illusion that could be actually repaired or corrected by facts, or with mistaken or distorted representation of its social content. To put it succinctly, a political standpoint can be quite accurate, true to the facts, as it is its objective content, yet thoroughly ideological, and vice versa. The idea of a political standpoint gives of its social content can prove totally wrong. Yet there's absolutely nothing ideological about it. Yeah, ideological in the first sense. So in other words, in political speech, it is definitely possible to lie with the truth. Hence, ideology is not only a matter of objective content, but also about position, situation, power structure. Who says what, at which moment, in what setting and situation. Zizek's point, however, goes a little bit further. Ideology goes beyond political speech, opinions, and standpoints. That was also a brief mentioning of the song by Eno 4. It also stretches to selfhood, desire, affect, and the unconscious. And of course, the broader the meaning of ideology gets, the lesser its specificity and significance. In the 1970s, the structuralist Marxist philosopher Althusser, I already mentioned him, introduced another very influential formula of ideology that in its conceptual abstractness, some say vagueness, also covers most of these meanings. I'll get to this later, I'll just read it first out. Ideology represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. Don't ask me now what the imaginary is or the real, but again, ideology represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. From the formal structure, you will immediately get the point, okay, it's again a relation of relation, or relation of non-relation, because obviously there is a mismatch between the imaginary relationship and the real conditions of existence. So in such a theory design, ideology is always necessary to create a link between the individual and his or her conditions of life. As much as this relationship always remains imaginary, those real conditions of existence never enter the realm of existence. Only on a conceptual level, let's say theory, in the realm of ideology, so to speak, or ideology theory, this relationship can be addressed, called out, and, if possible, be changed. Such transformation, however, does not transcend the confines of ideology, at least not for Althusser. The real kernel of reality remains inaccessible to everyday experience and one's imaginary relationship to the world. So there's a clear cut here between the world that you can experience, that you have aesthetic access to, you may say, through being in the world, and the truth of it, that would be the real, the relation to one's real conditions of existence. They might be reconstructed in theory, but they don't enter consciousness via experience. Well, that's a problem of the theory. You would say, that is a deadlock, and you will never get out of ideology. And I think Althusser was also quite consequential, kind of coherent here, because he didn't call it anymore ideology critique, he called it ideology theory. Because critique would still at least have the, from his point of view, illusion that you could overcome ideology. And acknowledging that kind of deadlock, because you stay in ideology, Frederick Jameson, and that's another author here that I introduced that wasn't in the abstract, Frederick Jameson, he proposed kind of an updated version of neo-Marxist ideology critique in the age of late capitalism, or what he called later post-modernity. And he calls that cognitive mapping. Some of you may be familiar with that. It aims basically at the spatial conceptualization of Althusser's famous formula. And, you can read it here again. Ideology represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. So cognitive mapping, or kind of a spatial representation of that formula, would then at least have the advantage that I could have an empirical aesthetic account of, because space would be something that stretches to the domain of the aesthetic, of everyday experience. But of course, you cannot have access to what the real conditions of existence are in Althusser. However, Jameson adds that complication. Ideology then fills the gap between the local positioning, or mapping, of the individual subject and the totality of class structures, and also the other structures, mainly class structures, in which he or she is situated. So it is about filling the gap between the phenomenological perception, which enters consciousness via our being in the world, and a reality that transcends all individual thinking or experience, something which is non-accessible or only accessible in theoretical thought via self-reflection and so on. Cognitive mapping is, so to speak, kind of a GPS we would call today in the domain of ideology. So how do we position ourselves vis-a-vis the imaginary of what is totality, society, a group, or whatever? He takes that concept actually from urban studies. It was invented by, not Lynch, the director, another Lynch, a kind of an urban theorist, urban studies theorist, who talked about how people imagine their cityscapes, how they relate to what kind of maps do you draw when you position yourself in a city, in a neighborhood. And this kind of spatial mapping concept, Jameson combined them with that otherwise more famous formula of Althusser. So in this sense, Jameson's approach could be understood as a spatial mapping of that gap, the gap between the imaginary relationship of individuals and their real conditions of existence. So Jameson's project of cognitive mapping engages them in a kind of spatial analysis of culture, which is based on the historicization of 3 historical stages of capital. And each stage has produced its own cognitive mapping of space specific to it. And this is the, I'm not following it fully because it's kind of abstract and it's very generalizing, but it has also some advantages. So Jameson comes up with 3 stages. More or less we can immediately associate some authors with it. The first one goes with, by the name of the Age of Enlightenment, disciplined society. The name Foucault probably will immediately pop up, the panopticon of Bentham. So the space of classical or market capitalism, and that is organized and imagined in terms of the logic of the grid. Now you would think of Baroque or absolutist city grids, and also of course the architecture that comes with it. You would say that still stretches somehow to the boulevards of Haussmann in Paris, but that's already getting more complicated. So the logic of the grid, a reorganization of some older, sacred, and heterogeneous space into geometrical and Cartesian homogeneity. Again, this is the imagination. That's the mapping of it, of society. a space of infinite equivalence and extension, of which you can find a kind of dramatic or emblematic shorthand representation to Foucault's take on prisons, obviously. The second one he calls the age of imperialism, kind of a Leninist term. You could also call it the age of Marxist modernism. That is solid, melts into air. That is the age where you have the dialectical mismatch of essence versus appearance. So what you see is not what you get. And he writes about that second age. Of course, most of the treatment in that short essay on cognitive mapping is on the second, let's say, modernist age. The problems of figuration that concern us will only become visible in the next stage, the passage from market to monopoly capital, roughly speaking, 19th century, 20th century, or what Lenin called the stage of imperialism. And they may be conveyed by way of a growing contradiction between lived experience and structure, or between a phenomenological description of the life of an individual and a more properly structural model, a model of the conditions of existence of that experience. And if you look at the major theoretical work of the 19th century, the dialectical capitalism, you find immediately that dialectic of Wesen und Erscheinung, or essence and appearance. If you want to structure a lived experience, you just have to remember the first sentence of Marx's Capital Volume 1. It's very precise in that. The wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears, erscheint in German, as an immense collection of commodities. The individual commodity appears as its elementary form. Of course, to that degree, old Marx is a Hegelian. The point is that essence and appearance are not two things. It's the same thing in its two modes. I.e., reality is split. Split or splitting or binaries is not a product of theory, but the very condition or constitution of reality itself. So, to this degree, you can also take Hegel's formula: the essence of essence is to appear. What doesn't appear has no essence. But the problem is that the mode of appearance, therefore, i.e. presentation and Darstellung is such important modernist topos, is not a kind of one-to-one translation. The way how essence appears is a torsion, is something that works with displacement, with kind of shifting. And I take this actually, I don't have it in the paper, but if you're interested in that, it's a beautiful paper by Baudrillard on Hegel and Freud, and why Freud doesn't have negation in psychoanalysis. He only has 6 fair words that actually translate negativity or negation in psychoanalysis, and they're all fair means it's a prefix in German, which roughly translates into D, trans, and I don't know, it's kind of some kind of movement involved, some kind of shift. Of course, if you know German, you know them. Verwerfung, Verneinung, Verleugnung, what is it else? Verdrängung, of course, and Versprechen, and I also was 6. Look them up. Actually, it's a great paper. So, but without going into the details here, you have a problem now: truth versus experience. And I may bore you here with another famous quote. That is Bertolt Brecht. It's one of the famous Brecht quotes, actually, because Walter Benjamin took it up and quoted it at length in his essay on photography, the one from 1931, where he talks about the non-naturalist nature of photography. So, I'm reading you the original words, the original translation from Brecht. It's 1930. And Brecht says, the situation has become so complicated because the simple reproduction of reality, we may say representation, says less than ever about that reality. A photograph of the proverbs, stewards, for the IED, electricity company, reveals almost nothing about these institutions. Reality as such has slipped into the domain of the functional. The ratification of human relations, the factory, for example, no longer discloses those relations. So there is indeed something to construct, something artificial or invented. Hence there is in fact a need for art. The old concept of art, derived from experience, is obsolete for those who show only the experiential, experience-related aspect of reality, do not reproduce reality itself. Of course, here Benjamin stops and then he says, therefore, if you want a real realist concept of reality, look at surrealist photography. You learn more about reality than the naturalist one-to-one idea would have. Of course, Brecht had his own kind of denaturalization, defamiliarization technique, of course, epic theater or technique of estrangement or Verfremdung. But now going back to the 90s to Jameson, there's a challenge for cognitive mapping. How to come to terms with the aesthetic unrepresentability of social structure. Obviously, you have to do something, you have to build up something. You need props to do so. I mean, artistic techniques, figuration, and so on. In the realm of literary theory, that is also the field of Frederick Jameson, you have to work with figurative models of speech and allegories, symbols, symptom, and so on. Of course, you can also go to aesthetic modernism, abstract art. Benjamin focused mostly on surrealism. We can leave it there. Of course, that's a very general formula and leaves out a lot of deviations from this model. But let's take his argument and move to the third stage. Of course, he's looking at the 1970s and 80s. Those who are familiar with Frederick Jameson know he wrote this famous book on the cultural turn, late capitalism and postmodernity, postmodernism actually. He started with architecture. So he looks at the postmodern space. By the way, for Jameson, that second stage, age of imperialism, is the age of the economy of time, whereas the third one is for an important deviation from the modernist project in postmodernity, is kind of a management of space. And he looks at this postmodernist space, and what he sees there is the crushing, so-called crushing of the aura. You have the quote by Benjamin. So the new space evolves via the suppression of distance and the relentless saturation of any remaining voids and empty places. And furthermore, the result is the insertion of individual subjects into a multi-dimensional set of radical, discontinuous realities, today we call it bubbles, or gated communities, whose frames range from still surviving spaces of bourgeois private life all the way to the unimaginable decentering of global capital itself. Today we are much more embedded in digital technologies and social media. I think it went much further. So the idea is that you have a kind of pastiche montage as lived experience, as a life work, not as an artistic treatment of social reality. Benjamin is important because in his essay on the work of art in its age of mechanical reproduction, he had that theory that the aura is crushed. The aura was their stand-in of distance, or something kind of the unique apparition of a distance, how near it may be. There's something, he has three examples from sacred objects of Christianity. you can touch it, but you can't get close. There's something you won't get your hands on. And he says, Jameson now says, that kind of aura has been crushed. Benjamin still had this kind of communist wager that you could politicize that kind of destruction of aura, but Jameson is a little bit less optimistic about that. So we don't really know how we could further qualify that postmodern space, but it would be kind of a montage of different spaces into each other, onto each other. I mean, our city experiences, I lived for a while in Beirut, it's actually a very good example of how a montage of discontinuous realities on various levels actually work. Of course, we need the commodity form as a kind of unifying totality to organize and run that. You would also say it has to do with the decline of the state, maybe Fordism to post-Fordism, or the state, would privatize or outsource some of its core functions. But what interests me here with Jameson is the fate of critique in the age of late capitalism. What he calls the third stage, or this age of late capitalism or postmodernity. And Benjamin also, he said already in 1928, critique is a matter of correct distancing. And that is already a problem when you have a new techno-capitalist advertisement industry. That is the first aphorism of One-Way Street, roughly speaking 1926-7 when he wrote that. So that already points to Jameson's point that you have a problem of critique. And if you look at more recent works on critique, you find probably books that are called anti-critique, post-critique, have we ever been critical? I was not making a joke of regards of Latour, have we ever been modern? You can, of course, have that more polemical take on critique, we don't need it anymore. But there's a true kernel to that, according to Jameson. So as Jameson points out, these three stages of capitalism, so Enlightenment, imperialism, and postmodernity, and their respective modes of cognitive mapping, again, grid, split of appearance and essence, and collapsing of distance, are materialized in artistic and architectural figurations. So they take shape. They take shape in Bentham's Panopticon, in street cafes, where Benjamin said, or Baudrillard, and it goes to postmodern shopping malls and these very antiquated airport architectures that we hate so much when we change from one plane to the other. I think the worst one is Sami Khatib this time. I'm sorry to say that, but I really think that is one of the worst airport architectures where you have this no space to rest and only the worst shopping opportunities also. Anyways, in this context, we can also have a different take, of course, on that kind of split nature that is specific of the second stage. And let's have a look here at Hegel's lectures of fine art. They were delivered in the 1820s, and they could be regarded as the advent of a specific modern, or in Jameson's terminology, imperialist type of cognitive mapping, in which the rational grid of the Enlightenment breaks into the splinters of the dialectics of appearance and essence. I'm going to read this quote for you. It's here. That's from the introduction of the first volume on Lectures on Fine Art. Art makes every one of its productions into a thousand-eyed Argus, whereby the inner soul and spirit is seen at every point, and is not only the bodily form, the look of the eyes, the countenance and posture, but also actions and events, speech and tones of voice, and the series of their course through all conditions of appearance that art has everywhere to make into an eye, in which the free soul is revealed in its inner infinity. also, Hegel's surprising point here is that every work of art looks back at the spectator like a thousand-eyed Argus panopticon. Now, Argus is the myth from Greek mythology. Argus panopticus was that unlucky giant with 100 eyes who was hired by the goddess Hera to watch over Io, a nymph that Zeus fell in love with and was transformed into a white cow. As the legend has it, Argus could sleep at all times by closing some of his eyes, while the majority would always be open on the watch. It is this feature of watching eyes that informs the fantasy behind Jeremy Bentham's famous text Panopticon from 1787, a treatise on the logic and architecture of so-called inspection houses, mainly prisons and other correction facilities. Ever since then, the name Panopticon is linked to the modern myth of surveillance, architecture, and enlightened, transparent power, an age that Jameson called the first stage of capitalism, the grid. The Panopticon thus fits and figures the cognitive mapping of absolutist power. As the legend has it, Michel Foucault, however, referred to Bentham's Panopticon as the model of the modern intersection of power, knowledge, and architecture, so it's really anti-Jameson, which is, according to Jameson's historization, a predicament of the age of imperialism, the second stage of capitalism. The split of appearance and essence redoubles itself in the field of vision. Vision is not reciprocal and symmetrical. I look at you, you look at me, but an asymmetric power relation is at work here. I look at you, but you can't see me. Seeing while not being seen is the purpose of the architectural shape of the Panopticon that allows the prison guards to observe the inmates from a different perspective. As an architectural discursive machine of modernity, the Panopticon automatizes the non-reciprocity and asymmetry of seeing in order to produce standardized power effects that go beyond the visual field. In what Foucault calls disciplinary society, everything is about surveillance, not spectacle. This means that power relations and the field of the visual are constitutively interwoven. Here, the visual is not an innocent sense of an assumed natural human being, but a machine of power and surveillance, which produces separation, exclusion, isolation, and inspection. On the flip side of such a reading of the Panopticon, Hegel, however, situates the work of art, the modern work of art, as a medium presenting the asymmetry in the field of vision. Here we rely on Langelas' long comment on this passage in Hegel. We never simply watch an artwork, it watches us at the same time. Of course, here Hegel involves the traditional notion that the eyes are the seat of the soul. It's a revelation, a part of the body where the soul manifests itself. However, pushing Hegel a little bit, one could make him say that what makes art special is the way the object gaze is inscribed in the work of art. It is the kind of object which never simply exists out there, opposite the observing subject, separate and independent. If it is an artwork worthy of its name, it has the capacity to embody the gaze, to be not just the object of the gaze, but the object into which the gaze is inscribed, a short circuit between the subject and the object. In other words, theory does not have an external object at which it could simply look at. If I make art the theoretical object of my research, they also become the object of art, yet in a non-reciprocal, unexpected, maybe even unwanted manner. But how does art look back at me and embody my gaze? Of course, you could think of Mona Lisa's mysterious smile, or Chris Marker's film La Jetée, when the eye blink, you can see all these stills. But there remains a distance by which our gaze onto the object is deflected, refracted, and returned in an uncanny or uneven, asymmetrical way. It's interesting that Benjamin mentioned also this kind of uncanny asymmetry, but it shows a different medium. He mentioned the experience of people exposed to portrait photography in the early days of the medium. Humans who looked into the camera felt deprived of their gaze, which the machinic camera eye didn't return. It is this asymmetric mismatch in the field of vision that Benjamin calls the decay of aura in the age of technological reproducibility. The person we look at, or who feels he is being looked at, looks at us in turn. To experience the aura of an object we look at means to invest it with the ability to look back at us. But again, it's an imaginative faculty. We endow the object with that capacity. So with the decay of aura, this ability also decays, according to Benjamin. What comes to the fore instead is something else, the object's visual asymmetry. This visual displacement or asymmetry points to an uncanny reversal of looking and being looked at. The object looks back at the beholder, yet from an inaccessible position. So it's not like returning the gaze. There is a gaze, but that is not the returning of the gaze, because I cannot catch that gaze. It's only the aura that would give me that fantasy that could so. For theory, you could say aesthetic, cultural, critical, otherwise, this asymmetry has far-reaching consequences, which touch upon the very notion of theory in modern continental philosophy. Let us not forget that the word theory is derived from the Greek word theorein, which means to look at, to speculate, to observe, to contemplate, or to seize by gaze. The entire history of Western philosophy back to Plato is written as a metaphorization and spiritualization of gaze. It was Plato's contempt for the deceptive apparitions of the sensible that made him introduce a pure gaze beyond perception and the limits of physical vision. Theory means to see beyond the perception. The Latinized noun speculation lies at the core of ancient, medieval, and modern philosophy. Blandola rightly points to the fact that, quote, the history of philosophy could be written as the history of optical metaphors from Plato's cave to Marx's camera obscura of ideology. And of course you can add here a couple of books that dealt with this. Marx's camera obscura, Sarah Hofmann, or think of Speculum by Luce Irigaray, which is actually the best probably treatment of that. So in other words, the object of theory is not outside of vision, in safe intellectual distance, but mediated by theory's own way of seeing. What is at stake here undermines the traditional Kantian division of sensual intuition, or German Anschauung, on the one hand, and theoretical knowledge, or Begriff, conceptual knowledge, on the other. This is also why, from a Hegelian point of view, art can never be related to aesthetics in its very narrow sense. What singles out art then, as Blandola concludes, is that it is never simply an object. What we must decipher in its enigmatic appearance is the way we are inscribed in it. It regards us, it embodies our own gaze, appearing to us as an enigma that we cannot grasp self-reflexively. And self-reflexively, of course, stands here for intellectually only. So let's change I know we're late, 5 minutes. Let's change the theoretical design a little bit. So in the 1960s, The psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan addressed this enigma and the limits of self-reflection in terms of desire and drive. When we look at objects, our gaze is never neutral. Rather, what he calls the scopic drive inscribes us the beholder, into the object of vision. According to Lacan, there is not only the sexual drive and all its transformation, perversions, and displacements, but also a drive in the field of the visual. What we call image is animated by desire. Yet this desire does not belong to the beholder exclusively. Without going now into the details of Lacan's notoriously difficult psychoanalytical teachings and seminars, let us only focus on one aspect here, which follows from Lacan's discovery of the scopic drive. He calls it the split between gaze and vision. Vision designates the subjective dimension of seeing that he also calls the eye. It is the eye from where the act of seeing receives its direction and impulse. Yet the eye and its vision do not coincide with its gaze. The theoretical scandal of Lacan's thesis consists in stripping the eye of its gaze. The eye only concerns the subjective dimension of seeing, yet its objective dimension, the gaze, belongs to the object. Moreover, the gaze is the object, materialized, embodied. It is my gaze, but it doesn't belong to me, because the object, its gaze, is looking back at me. In other words, when the subject looks at an object, the object is always already gazing back at the subject, but from a point of view where the subject cannot see it and cannot return it. Again, exactly that which Benjamin wanted to, let's say, solve through aura. No? So the fantasy that the object, or the person here, returns my gaze, called aura. Lacan offered a series of seemingly paradoxical formulae to grasp this split. Some of them are listed here. You never look at me from the same place from which I see you. Conversely, what I look at is never what I wish to see. So the space of vision is never a geometrical space. It's curved by desire, if you want, a scopic drive. The picture is in my eye, but I am in the picture. Fun fact here, actually, if you read Seminar 11, where this sentence is in, is mistranslated. Sheridan, the translator, could not imagine that Lacan would say such a sentence. Well, the picture is in my eye, but I am not in the picture, he thought. He translated. No, I am in the picture. The picture is in my eye, but I am in the picture. So this kind of inscription into the picture via seeing. So the picture is in my eyes, or my one eye. This is what we call vision. It's a subjective dimension of seeing. But it's also me who is in the picture. That is to say, I am in the picture where my scopic drive has inscribed my desire into the picture. Don't start here with Heidegger. I know we are in the picture, the world, what's it called in Germany? Das Zeitalter des Weltbildes, the age of world picture, of course. If you want, you can read this together, but I need to start. Let's stick to Lacan. I want to see, and it is this wanting, the desire, this visual desire that attaches me to the picture and thereby creates a blind spot in the object. It is this blind spot, stain or splinter, created through and by my desire from where the picture looks back at me. This is what Lacan calls the gaze. It is not that there is a stain in my eye distorting my vision. It's on the contrary. My look upon the object is this stain. I see through it. It is, to use Adorno's words, my magnifying glass. I want to relate this to theory, but again, theory, Theorein, grasping through vision. So this is meant by the split of the field of vision between the eye and gaze, a constitutive non-reciprocity of looking and being looked at, which Hegel hinted at when comparing art to an object becoming an eye. An argus panoptis. Taking this insight to its ultimate conclusion, we cannot anymore assume that subject and object, beholder and object are separated. They are mediated by and through the scopic drive. This mediation, however, doesn't show itself transparently. It works with the fantasy of transparency, but it is not transparent. What transparency is its very core. It presents itself as a split between eye and gaze, as a subjective and objective dimension of seeing. Vision is thus always distorted, curved and asymmetric, and this distortion happens precisely where everything is revealed, where everything can be seen in almost microscopic surgical detail. Baudrillard half-jokingly reminds us that there is no full frontal nudity of the gaze. Where we see all, we still don't see our desire in the picture, from where the picture, and as gaze, looks back at us. If we are always to miss the point from where the object as gaze is looking back at us, we can still try to find an articulation of this mismatch to produce a central embodiment, a figuration, a presentation of the split between eye and gaze. And of course, here would be the point where you can actually insert cognitive mapping and Jameson again. I don't have the time. Huh? Yeah. But wait, one more sentence. Modern art, of course, looking now back, was the privileged yet non-exclusive side where this presentation was to be enacted. Theory, too, can be this medium in which the mismatch or negativity of the field of vision can be grasped. As I said with Adorno, the splinter in your eye is the best magnifying glass. Okay, let's stop here. The rest we can do later. Of course, now, very briefly, now I go to the negativity of art. And Adorno and his famous quote, "The darkening of the world makes the irrationality of art rational, radically darkened art." What is negativity in art? How can we still get the presentation to it when, or if, Jameson was right and cognitive mapping has deflated the critical distance, and all these metaphors of theory of self-reflexivity, mirroring, but also displacement do not work anymore. The space for critique isn't there anymore. You can only do kind of micro-mapping. And I would end, but I can send you this with Kamal Al-Jafari's film Recollection. But I'll tell you about it later after the break. But I think still you can do a critical spatial analysis of culture as cognitive mapping in this, what Jameson called third stage of capital, i.e. post-modernity, where say this encroaching of the suspension of critical distance that was still possible in the modern age, where you had at least the thematization, a figuration, a presentation of the split of eye and vision, or other theoretical devices to which you could give a presentation, a figuration of the split of essence and appearance. But let's stop here. We can use bigger. Thanks for the attention.
Thank you, Sami. I'm opening the floor for questions, thoughts, ideas, if anyone has. I think it's going to be a silent evening.
I have a question for you.
Sami, I have a question. Why is it still possible?
What?
You told us that you think that, again, this third condition of the collapsing of the distance, it is still possible. Critic is still possible, but you say not how. No, I'm very curious.
Yeah, you know, call me in a couple of weeks when I have read, I'm rereading now Baudrillard's work. Somehow I find it absolutely wrong, but also absolutely fascinating, and halfway I'm always on his side. okay, simulacra, no original, no simulation, everything is a relation of image. I look at memes of Baudrillard, of course, and he was, I think, such a prophet of the social media kind of embedded technology age we're living in. So somehow that all makes sense to me. And of course, I look at old Grumpy Cat, said Teddy Adorno, and I think, yeah, sure, what's the point? Want a self-reflection of negativity. Yeah, for whom? For some art collectors who put a nice, whatever, money in their gallery, forever, it's boring. However, I still think, and it's not just an argument on is the glass half full or half empty, look at it from the positive side, it's stupid self-help talk. No, I think there is a deadlock. I take it seriously, and I'm also not sure whether cognitive mapping is actually a critical project anymore. Look at James Yosu, dropped the concept. It was fashionable for a while. There was this book on Alan Sikula. There was, I think Alberto Toscano had this very good recent book on it, also pointed out the colonial legacy of mapping, Many problems with that concept, but I still think that you have certain moments where the real, our imaginative relation to our real existence of conditions of existence, pops up and shows itself in scans. It sounds lame, but I look at Documenta at this moment. I was at Documenta. I'm not saying that it is completely, it's non-Western art, maybe it's really one non-Western art, non-modernist art, but somehow I have the feeling, maybe an intuition at this stage, that it's an interesting way of cognitive mapping, because of mapping global space as mismatch of precisely that individual bubble, may call it, and what other people demand now as context. Where context is another word for please translate everything that there is into my bubble. In this case, German identity politics facing other narrations of what is the success or non-success, let's say, violence story of global capitalism. So I think you find that you have to do microanalysis. I'm not here for, I wouldn't say critique still has all the devices at hand. And I'm also not sure whether critique ever had it. I mean, critique was, in the modernist sense, strong, where it actually was embedded in a social struggle. There is no modernist art without class struggle, very simple. So, I'm interested in that. You can say contemporary art as art market, with its individualized attachment or version of critique as criticality. This is, of course, something that is really fully subsumed under the commodity form, and we may have to migrate from that. Of course, you will say we still need the funding, sure, we need to survive, but maybe this is something to migrate from. But that is not all. I think there are other conceptions these days, non-Western based on critique, that work with certain legacies, of Western legacies, lineages of critique, but combine it with other experiences. So I don't think cognitive mapping, again, the thematization or giving shape to the very unrepresentability of my life world vis-a-vis what we may call totality, the world market, global turns, streams of capital, and its very institutions, that this still is possible. I mean, it still is possible. We see those figurations. Of course, you can say, James in the same text says, conspiracy theory is the fool's way of doing cognitive mapping. Of course you can tell us, but you can also say, in conspiracy theory, there is, in all this ideological distortion, still the idea of what you see is not what you get. And how you translate this into structure or in other experiences, I think, is still possible in figurations of art. Maybe not so much on the narrative level, but also not only on a formal level, which have been a project of, let's say, late modernism. So
I was wondering if the question could be the notions of distance, because in all these forms, it is the gaze or the critical, the view or the critical, you point out the discontinuity and distance and disruption. Maybe there is something to think about this disruption, discontinuity, that we use in modern 18th century terms of experience of the gaze or experience of the view, to be precise in the term of Lacan. But maybe it is what I don't see. We could maybe, something to think would be what does happen when nothing is visible. So when there is total absence of visibility, other kind of questions and distances arises that we don't describe in these terms because we are always describing them in the terms of experience, which are terms of the 18th century. Maybe it could be interesting to think out of the schema of experience, but I don't know how to do it in philosophical terms because I'm not philosopher. I see it from an artistic point of view.
I agree, but again, distance, and also the way I presented distance here, was a very stable, contemplative way of doing it. If I allow myself to be a little bit more Hegelian, I would say, in today's parlance, there is only situated knowledge, there had never been anything else. Distance is situatedness, embeddedness, because embeddedness is flux, is always negativity at work. You're never there where you are. Everything is a movement. Because there is movement, there is distance, because there is interference and differentials. Differentials is what distance is. If you look for distance in the old bourgeois gaze onto art, of course, this is over and good, sir. I mean, fine. This fantasy is over to kind of non-enjoy or enjoy your discomfort at gazing at negativity of art, this kind of stuff. Feeling good because you're feeling bad, that's the apotheosis of the bourgeois contemplative stance that still would still mourn the loss of order, the loss of distance and so on. Come on, was never there, was always wrong already there. Good that your class privileges are a little bit endangered and you can be melancholic about it, but if it's gone, good. However, then we have to, of course, have a different understanding of space, spatialization, differential, movement, dialectics, negativity. If this is all put into motion, I think we can have, of course, I'm talking now actually something that I see in Hegel already. You can also see it in Spinoza probably, some writings of Deleuze, but also in others. I mean, don't have to be Western philosophy. That would allow for something different understanding of distance, and then of course a different understanding of critique. Critique would then be the auto-measuring and mapping of somebody attached to, thrown into, and subjected to a movement. He or she is not the agent, yes, but not the one who determines the direction. Something which is beyond control. I don't see why that shouldn't be possible. But don't forget, the whole point was why theory. I think theory could have a function there, but I don't see theory anymore as something, when I teach theory, people would say, what is the practical outcome? How can I apply it? Of course, we don't do that anymore. That's why we teach in art, because nobody in art says how do you apply it? Okay, that's the natural science, economics, bad sociology. Okay, but then what do we do in art with it? We exhibit the very functionlessness of theory as an artwork, as criticality, and sell that. Obviously, this is the flip side of that very bad notional theory. That's why I revisited the old problem of critique of ideology, ideology theory, and all these updates that have been recently done, or last 30 years done, and I think there is something to theory still, if it doesn't disavow its very embeddedness in, let's say, visuality. And I don't mean vision as metaphor. Theorein, I mean, we're saying theos, also God, it comes from something that has to be theorized as well. So maybe it's also an attempt to really get rid of all these splits of thinking versus intuiting, concept versus perception, or understanding versus sensuality, and of course theory today actually works into that direction. However, our problem today is maybe that we have a very crude materialism today, so that has not a lot of imagination of what body and matter actually means. That's the other point. But I think at least there are the symptoms that point to not use, but a different function of theory. So that's why I said first, it's not over yet. I'm not the one who delivers the sad message of we shouldn't do theory anymore. Come on, it's boring. It's a commodified criticality.
I'm sure about this, but I cannot explain it.
What's the different function?
Yeah. I can't tell you what it is, but I can tell you what it is not.
Okay.
It's not the function of where theory and art would be in parallel. And of course, I'm going back to Adorno. No? The function of art is its very functionlessness. So, the function of art would be that it exhibits the very deadlock of negativity in a self-reflective manner. Theory could be the same. This was, let's say, the last words of aesthetic modernism, I would say. And to this degree, I think Adorno was true to that. But I think there is also something else. This deadlock, I think, is done because it happens in commodified, where negativity in its very formal sense had already been turned into commodity. So there is, it's sad for Adorno, he also was the one who had this book, Negative Dialectics, as if dialectics is not negative enough. Of course it's negative enough, but what do you want? More negativity? That doesn't work in fact. So, in a way I can say, this not be. This would be the old paradigm of distance, of contemplation, of the history we are dealing with, or the fantasies and promises and desires we're dealing with are still here, but the moment to realize that has been missed. This moment historically has been missed. This is a paraphrase of Adorno's negative dialectic. I think this is a wrong narrative. First of all, you cannot objectify what is not historical moment of realization for philosophy. Who am I to tell this today? But I could say that theory surviving its own death and also being not fully relegated or subsumed to its function in the art market, its criticality, still allows us, in our very mode of speaking, to find other. I mean, functions maybe is not the wrong word. I already said use before, then I said function. Maybe these are the wrong words. Trajectories where, or through which power structures can still be addressed without coming out with everything is power, everything is discourse, where implication of speech into that which is being criticized can be addressed without ending up into a narcissist exhibitionism of Protestant morality. You know, I'm the guilty one because I have tons of privilege, blah blah. It's just boring and horrible. Which fits into the commodified individual itself, which is hardcore Protestantism, or formal Protestantism. I can give you a list of what theory is not or should not be, but I think there is still a lot to explore. I said still now so many times. course, it's a performative stance.
Yeah.
With all my arguments, you could exactly argue for the same. And you could also say that
But
paper doesn't
performative could be a better word than function.
Yeah.
Maybe the critic can be performative, still performative.
Yes. But still, I would say people have a right to say, what do you do with theory? Why do I do it at all? One way is I need theory as the kind of canon of the museum of thinking, because I would like to know what people had thought before in order to not be the fool who repeats everything one more time with a different label. I think this is already a very honorable function of theory. And maybe in a presentist age like today, a very important one. I would even say I would accept that. The archivar of thinking. It's not very interesting, but it's a function. Then you would say the other function is a non-function because it's an open, auto-performative movement or trajectory that looks into the open, which has maybe to do with the fact that we all speak English today, impoverished English, of course, where we bring in our native tongue and our, what is this here today, our new re-vernacularizations of also global English. When new experiences come together, what is it? It's the other one. I hear an echo.
Yes, it's this one.
Yes.
Yes, I want to share a thought which is still very vague and maybe it will transform into a question. I don't know yet. So my thought is somehow starting at the second stage of Jameson and with the difference between essence and appearance. And you mentioned also Freud there, like the Verfremdung, Vermeidung and stuff. So I was thinking, this fair, what is this? I don't know. And then you mentioned Brecht with Freud was Vermeidung, Versprechen, and then you mentioned Brecht with the Verfremdung. And I was thinking if the Verfremdung is maybe a kind of answer or reproduction of the Vermeidung, at least in the sense that it's both like this fair and that it somehow it's still working with this distance, and this fair maybe is more, it's not creating a distance, but it's more like a slippery, more like a dynamic. And I don't know if you can follow me, but I will continue. And I was then thinking, okay, if then the distance between essence and appearance, or distance in general, is disappearing, where to implement this fair, this dynamic of the slippery dynamic somehow, or this vibrating dynamic. And you mentioned Lacan, and I thought maybe the light spot has the dynamic of the fair. This maybe that doesn't. It's somehow something opaque. I don't know, but at least it's a dynamic. And then I thought, okay, if the distance is disappearing, where in modern art or in contemporary art we can see this movement of the fair. I don't know, I often miss it. I don't know if I can understand, like it's very abstract thought, I don't know.
It's not abstract at all, because you use a lot of fair words every day. It's not something you have to import as a theory to import into your language. When you speak German, you can really check it, auto-record yourself. In almost every sentence there is a fair word, which again, it means movement, asymmetric movement from here to there, kind of a trance, but also asymmetric negation. That's why it's so amazing. You use it anyways, all the time. And language does the deviation.
Yeah, but do you still see this fair dynamic in contemporary art?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look at contemporary art, how, I not want to name now things, but contemporary art is a wonderful promise and misspeaking of itself. Versprechen in its best Freudian understanding. But so first of all, thank you for your question. Sorry for I haven't said this correctly. It's not on the same conceptual level, how Freud translates negativity into a vocabulary of 6 nouns built out of German words that have the prefix ver. And then comes Verfremdung as well. No, Verfremdung, estrangement, is a treatment and is an artistic, political strategy to deal with the very deviation and, let's say, amplification of negativity. Not only in speech, because Freud's point with Lacan is that the unconscious is structured like a language. So it is not like that you could not speak it and then you are out of these words. And also don't forget, Kant gave us 2 fair words, Vernunft and Verstand, understanding and reason. It already starts there, Matthias. But now that you mentioned it, Verneinung is negation, Verdrängung is repression, Verwerfung is foreclosure, Verleugnung is disavow, Verdichtung, when you have to speak, condensation, and the most important one, which covers most of them, is Verschiebung. Displacement or dislocation, or moving, shifting, Abweichen, digression, deviation. So this would actually translate negativity or relation of non-relation into psychoanalysis, the very side of which, according to that theory, is language, is speech, in its very performativity. And now this could be read as a symptom of the experience of negativity. And what is the experience of negativity? The very mismatch of lived experience versus structures that I don't understand. Structure I'm exposed to, I'm subjected to, I'm part of, but are non-transparent. Even if they come with the fantasy of transparency, the transparency itself is what covers them. And then I have an artistic technique, so in a way, Brecht is the arch-modernist here. He's medium-specific. He brings in another fair word to deal with the other fairs.
And I was wondering if there today, when Verfremdung is maybe still working, maybe not, because we don't have the distance anymore, what could be another fair? This was my question. Like, because I think we need another reaction, and so this was, or if we, like, or is the fair still, is it lost? So this was somehow what I wanted to ask.
I don't know, but I have a lot of fair words that I would never say on stage. But I'll tell you later. But the ones that you don't say in public. By the way, as an exercise, if you go to Baudrillard and say simulacra, if you really want to jam the message, also those who learn German, I always say, write a normal German sentence and then identify each verb, go to the predicate, and then you add to each verb a fair, even though words not existing. You create the most hilarious perversion of sense. Really, it's insane. You can, of course, say that you don't need a distance for that. It's kind of a affirmative jamming of speech, which is a very simple thing. You don't need distance to it, because sometimes a speech of ideology is already its own critique. This depends on the audience. Trump was a good idea. There is nothing to correct there. Hitler already did this. Goebbels did this already. There is nothing, you don't need a critical distance to it. The speech is already self-critique, or is not. So obviously it's not the content, it's the position and the function of that speech that matters. And how you shift that without a distance, yeah. The distance can also be, I don't have the distance because I'm next to a gun, a barrel of a gun that cannot move at all. You know, these are different questions then, but I would insist you can still do the fair move, because we are still in the fair. Of course you would say, this is only true for German language, but there are other languages that have other, let's say, linguistic devices for which deviation of sense, or the, you can say the metastasis of meaning, so metaphor and metonymy are expressed. The German is just very formal, because the fair VER is just so elegant. I must say, thanks to Baudrillard, I found this out, and it never occurred to me.
Thank you, Sami. Thank you all.